Welcome back to Module 2, Rebuilding Ohio. This lecture continues the subject of the last lecture, how Ohio became a northern rather than a western state. The implications are clear. The transition in identity from western to northern meant that Ohioans had to reject the pan-Mississippian world, a world that they had done so much to create, a world of technological progress and prosperity that was founded on slavery. Rejecting this world helped set the stage for Ohio's prominent role in the Civil War. Our focus in this lecture is the new transportation network that connected Ohio to New York City, rather than New Orleans. Our story begins not in Ohio, but in New York with the building of the Erie Canal. Built between 1817 and 1825, the original Erie Canal traversed 363 miles. It was the longest artificial waterway and the greatest public works project in North America. It transported goods and people across the northern part of New York back and forth from Buffalo and Lake Erie in the west to Albany and the Hudson River in the east. Before the Erie Canal, that trip took 2 weeks. After, 5 days. And the price of transport fell by 90%. The Erie Canal put New York on the map as the Empire State, the leader in the nation in population, in industry, and in economic strength. Of course, everyone's real goal was to reach New York City, not Albany, but that merely required a trip down the Hudson River to New York City and its ocean port. Because of the Erie Canal, New York City became the nation's principal port, the nation's most populous city, and the nation's foremost seat of commerce and finance. If only Ohioans could find a way to connect to New York's Erie Canal. If only they could get their goods quickly to Lake Erie so that they need not cross the cumbersome Appalachian Mountains or sail down the Ohio to the Mississippi to New Orleans. New York, that's where Ohioans wanted to be. If only, in other words, Ohioans had their own canal that connected the southern part of the state, its most populated and economically developed part, to Lake Erie, its least populated and least economically developed part. And in 1825, the state of Ohio started construction on the Ohio and Erie Canal. It took 7 years to build, and when completed was 308 miles long, connecting Portsmouth on the Ohio River to Cleveland on Lake Erie. When Ohio began construction, the governor of New York and the governor of Ohio met near Newark, Ohio, to dig the first hole. And they faced east when they dug their shovels into the ground. Why? Not because the sun was setting in the west and it bothered their eyes, or because the western landscape was prettier than the eastern landscape. No, they turned east for a reason. They turned east to symbolize the beginning of a change. Ohioans would no longer look west and south toward New Orleans, but increasingly they would look east to New York City. The Miami Canal took longer, in part because of funding issues, but when completed it was 245 miles long and connected Cincinnati and Toledo. So now both the eastern and western parts of the state were connected from north to south, from river to lake. So how did the canals change the state of Ohio? First, the northern third of the state began to grow, in terms of both population and economic activity. In Akron, farmers saw the price of the wheat doubling after the Ohio and Erie Canal was completed. They could now meet growing demand in eastern cities for western wheat. In Toledo, the value of trade activity increased from $8 million in 1840 to $31 million in 1850. And in the little town of Milan, best known as the birthplace of Thomas Edison, it became for a few years in the late 1840s the second largest grain port in the world, behind only Odessa, Russia. And Cleveland, which had been a largely stagnant town before the Ohio and Erie Canal, it emerged as a hub, shipping western commodities, wheat, corn, and lumber, to New York City, and eastern manufactured goods to western markets. So the canals were important because it was the first transportation technology to challenge the primacy of the Ohio River and the Appalachian Mountains. And it was the first transportation technology as well to chip away at this pan-Mississippian world. Railroads continued what the canals began. The first railroads in Ohio were very often financed by British investment. And it was the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad in the mid-1850s that was the first to cross the Appalachians into Ohio. By 1860, Ohio had built nearly 3,000 miles of track, leading the nation. The consequences are clear. As this map shows, railroad networks before the Civil War were built mostly in an east-west direction. That made New York more important to Ohio than New Orleans. Faster, cheaper travel improved profits. And if the canals chipped away at the pan-Mississippian world, then the railroads completely undermined it. Leaving the pan-Mississippian world meant abandoning slavery. The problem for many white Ohioans was that both slavery and blacks threatened their growing sense of their state as a land of freedom, industry, and morality. Black people, many whites believed, simply couldn't learn the individual skills and attain the required discipline to be free, to be economically independent. William Holmes McGuffey had taught Ohioans how to be sober, how to be thrifty, how to be hardworking, but he hadn't taught them that those traits had nothing to do with race. So Ohioans rallied to the cause of anti-slavery only when, in the 1850s, Southerners threatened Ohio as Ohioans had come to understand it. For example, in 1850, the U.S. Congress passed the Fugitive Slave Law. This law created a group of federal commissioners who could issue warrants for the arrest of fugitives. A slaveholder needed only testimony of a white witness or an affidavit from a slave state court to prove that the person was in fact a slave. And the fugitive had no right to testify on his or her own behalf. And the federal government paid commissioners more when they ruled that the person in question was in fact a fugitive slave. And federal marshals were used to apprehend these fugitives, and they could require citizens to offer their help. Refusing meant a fine. Harboring a fugitive meant jail time. The Fugitive Slave Law of 1850 forced Ohioans to be directly complicit in slavery. Slavery was no longer an economic transaction, a sale of pork to some distant place, the interest on a loan to grow and sell cotton. Federal law required Ohioans, and all Americans, to help return slaves to plantations. This law motivated Harriet Beecher Stowe to write Uncle Tom's Cabin. Stowe herself harbored fugitive slaves, and other Ohioans openly disobeyed the Fugitive Slave Act. On September 13, 1858, for example, a federal marshal in Oberlin, Ohio, arrested a fugitive slave named John Price. To avoid conflict with local people, he took Price to a nearby Wellington. An Oberlin group then went to Wellington to free Price, and the marshal and his deputies took refuge in a local hotel. After peaceful negotiations failed, the mob stormed the hotel and found Price in the attic. They returned him to Oberlin, where they hid him in the home of Oberlin College's president. A short time later, they took Price to freedom in Canada. Now, a federal grand jury then indicted 37 of the people who freed Price, and Ohio authorities responded by arresting the federal marshal, his deputies, and other men involved. State and federal authorities cut a deal, charging only 2 men, 1 black and 1 white, with the crime. They were found guilty and sentenced to a short term. They appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court, who upheld the constitutionality of the federal law. In response, more than 10,000 people participated in a Cleveland rally to oppose the Fugitive Slave Act. In this photograph, you can see many of the men gathered in front of the Cuyahoga County Jail, proud that they had disobeyed an immoral federal law. We can see Ohio's break from the pan-Mississippian world in an editorial written by the Ohio State Journal in 1859. The journal said that a Southerner was an idle, pleasure-seeking, heedless, improvident, and extravagant person who scarce moves hand or foot without the assistance of crouching, abject slaves. Now note the key words here: idle, pleasure-seeking, improvident. All of these words could have come directly from a William Holmes McGuffey reader, moralizing on how not to live your life. And of course that word Southerner. No longer were Kentuckians, Alabamians, Mississippians, Westerners united with Ohio. They were Southerners. Ohioans were Northerners. When war came, Ohioans were intent on changing the South, reforming it, rebuilding it to look more like Ohio. And Ohio provided some of the best leadership of the war on either side, with Ohio-born generals Ulysses Grant and William Tecumseh Sherman. And as of December 1st, 1864, nearly 350,000 Ohio soldiers were in service to the Union. And a few thousand of them went to war knowing of, and perhaps even having participated in, the European revolutions of 1848. Those revolutions to throw off unrepresentative governments and extend democratic rights to more people. How is that possible? Well, know that overall there were 20 to 25% of the Union military forces that were foreign-born during the Civil War. And in Ohio, there were approximately 20,000 German-born Ohio soldiers. And remember, those German immigrants created international networks. They exchanged information all the time. They heard about, read about, conversed about those revolutions. And some of them even participated in them. And when they failed, as many did, they left, immigrating to the U.S. For many German-born soldiers in Ohio, the U.S. Civil War was a second chance to get the revolution right. Did they succeed? Well, that's the subject of our first lecture in the next module. So we should close Module 2, noting that transportation technology moved Ohioans, not just from point A to point B, but moved them ideologically. Marietta sailing ships and Cincinnati steamboats made Ohioans Westerners, part of a pan-Mississippian world of technological progress, prosperity, and slavery. Canals and railroads, however, turned Ohioans to the east, toward New York City, and to a world in which slavery was morally offensive and inimical to hard work, success, and freedom.